I'm Evan Closky, joined with Aaron Parseghian, and there are a lot of questions pertaining to this vote coming at the Pinellas County Commission tomorrow surrounding those bonds of whether or not we're going to have a new stadium in St. Pete, whether or not the Tampa Bay Rays are going to be here in the future. And it's a lot to dissect. We try to do it on Twitter, X, whatever means possible. We try to do it in the stories that we provide on 10tampabay.com. But it is nuanced, and it provides a lot of what-if statements and what can happen. So that's why Aaron and I are going to take this conversation that we typically have in the newsroom every day, and we're going to provide it to you guys on whatever medium you're watching this. So, Aaron, from the very beginning, let's just start with the bare basics of why is this vote at the Pinellas County Commission tomorrow so important, and what are the Rays potentially going to do if they do not get the bonds?
Well, the vote's so important because this is essentially the financing for the stadium, which is the centerpiece of this entire multi-billion-dollar redevelopment in St. Pete. So the way it works is the city was going to have to pass their bonds to basically afford the financing for their portion. And the county was going to have to do the same thing at the county level. So we're talking about, $312 million that will be pulled out of this fund over, the next 20 to 30 years or however it's supposed to go there. And then tack on interest, we're talking about several $100 million that the county has to invest in the stadium project.
At the county level, they're committing to where this pot of money is going to be pulled out of. Let's break down that scene first. So you have to remember that there was a 5-2 vote back in July. They had that 5-2 procedural vote, which is a good indicator that the bonds were going to be approved moving forward. Now, even backtracking a little bit more, the Tampa Bay Rays and the county, and the city of St. Pete really pushed their deadlines as far as what they consider deadlines on both sides, as far as they possibly could. You have to remember that Tropicana Field, after 2028, the Rays don't have a home. That's when the lease expires on the Trop. So you have to figure the amount of time that it's going to take to build a stadium and then negotiate everything that comes with that. You have a certain runway there. And with the Rays, considering the 15-plus years that they really put into trying to get a new stadium and all the different routes they took, they took it up to the very last kind of minute of what are they going to do. And we'll circle back to that portion because that is going to layer ourselves into the relocation discussion and so on and so forth. But the reason why there's some pressure on this vote and why the Rays want this thing approved as soon as possible is because time is of the essence for a lot of reasons. So going back to October, Hurricane Milton makes landfall October 10th. All right? If there is no Hurricane Milton, there is no discussion really happening here. The bonds would have been approved at the end of October, and we would have been smooth sailing unless some unforeseen event would have happened beyond that. But it seems like we would have had shovels in the ground in January. Mostly everything looked like it was all systems are a go, and that's because there were a certain group of people who were for it with that 5-2 vote, and the landscape has now changed.
Yeah, and there was, essentially parties in July after that 5-2 vote at the county level because they were like, all right, it's a done deal. We can move forward. We just have to work through the financing. And as you pointed, it was not just Milton, but Helene, a week and a half, 2 weeks before that, which wrecked the beaches in Pinellas County as far as the storm surge and the sand that was, all over the place.
Exactly. So that's where things, and I appreciate you bringing up Hurricane Helene because I should mention that while we've always feared kind of having that once-in-a-century type of storm, and Helene and Milton by themselves weren't quite like that. But when you combine Helene with the storm surge and Milton with the wind event that happened in St. Pete, you pretty much got the worst-case scenario when you combine both of them in a 2-week span. And that vote to delay near the end of October was a bipartisan delay. So we had that 5-2 vote that was for going to the next step, which were the bonds, the financing, everything you talked about. That delay vote was 6-1. So you mostly had everybody there in the county saying, hold up, it's probably a bad look for us right now to really give, $300+ million to the stadium deal when all we have at that, and you got to take yourself back to that time and place, when there are images of beaches ruined and everything along the coast there just trashed. And there are a lot of questions that probably need to be answered. So that was sort of what we heard in that county commission meeting. And there were concerns also brought up there with the sole dissenting vote on the delay, saying, understanding that the politics of this could change, saying if we don't do this now, you're kind of putting this on the back burner and you're thinking short-term versus long-term. And so we have Latvala and Eggers the first time around were no. So when you talk about the 5-2, those are no's. Those no's are still there. Then we talk about the two new guys coming in and their positions, which they're going to be kind of their first line of duty is stepping into this, but they have been very vocal about being against the deal. The politics of this has changed. So we went from a 5-2 yes to we still have the two carryovers plus the two newbies, which would create a 4-3 no. Just ostensibly without, really asking them more questions, just on where their stances have been up to this point. Not saying that's where their stance will be moving forward, but up to this point, we look at it objectively and why people are saying, red flags. That is why. Because there are 4 no's in there as they've currently stated. Unless something changes, that would be the concern. And that's the big tough part here is that the Rays and the city beforehand pushing this deadline and kind of moving very fast. And that's been a concern at the county level from some, is just how fast this has been moving and whether the fiscal responsibilities make sense. It could not. The point is they want more time to sift through it and don't feel like they've been given enough time to do so. And then you also have the Rays saying, do this now or else, breathing down their necks, which objectively, again speaking, the Rays have a significant amount of leverage here. All right. In this situation, you have to understand that the city of St. Pete has already said yes. They have said yes to their portion, right? But the deal also hinges on the county saying yes to theirs. And when this all was concocted at the very beginning, Mayor Welch had a pretty good landscape that he can get the votes in the city and that the county was going to be a layup. That's the way that it always looked. And now the landscape of that has completely changed. So now the Rays have to really be on the offensive here, where for the most part, and look, I say for the most part recently, because it's bobbed and weaved throughout their 15 years of pursuing this, and we've had different mayors and all this stuff and yada, yada, yada. The stadium fatigue is absolutely real in our area. But during this last kind of session, since Mayor Welch has come in, there's been this belief that Mayor Welch can bring it home. And that's how it kind of looked up until that delay vote, and now everything has changed within the county commission.
Yeah, and even with that change, Mayor Welch has said he's committed to seeing this thing through, and he's made it a point every time I've talked to him, up until this point, I haven't talked to him personally recently. He said the same thing, that this is the closest and furthest this process has ever been along in these 15 years. As you said, there's been stadium discussion. So if you look at it in that hindsight, they're still comfortable with where they're at. Obviously, a lot more uncomfortable than they were back in July. But they're seeing this as, there's still a path forward, and that's what they're going to be pursuing. Tomorrow, if that vote does occur at the county level, I don't anticipate it to. I'd expect another delay, but seeing where that goes from there. And then obviously you have the Rays owner saying different things to the Tampa Bay Times.
That's right. So Stu Sternberg goes on the record with John Romano of the Tampa Bay Times, which is kind of, I like to say, the Molotov cocktail was kind of thrown on his side, right? I mean, one can argue that the commission has done that through the delay. They might argue that. Stu might argue that. But the fact is, when we talk about the leverage, remember, this is the team. So he's out there kind of saying relocation is certainly an option. We might have to leave the area. We need these bonds. So let's talk about why that is the case. First off, the Rays, and actually let's cover this first. The Rays, throughout this process, they have needed a home, right? We learned fairly recently that the Trop was not going to be an option for 2025 for the Tampa Bay Rays to play. That's a really tough spot for the Tampa Bay Rays to be in, considering the season begins at the end of March. Everything, the roof flies off that place, October 10th, whatever it was, and then immediately you're thinking November, December, January, February. I got 5 months here to figure out where my professional baseball team is going to play. And luckily for the Rays, they are in an area with rich minor league baseball and a lot of stadiums. And some members of the county commission were not happy with the lack of communication from the Tampa Bay Rays throughout that process. So, and certainly Commissioner Latvala has made it known in that last meeting, he said, look, whether they play in Pinellas County, if they play in Pinellas County, I'm not saying that I'm a no or a yes, right? But if they play in Hillsborough, I'm a no. That was essentially his quote. And there were many members in the county commission who were upset with the Tampa Bay Rays playing in Tampa in 2025, which I think is an important part of this process, because that did kind of throw, no pun intended, a curveball a little bit in the relations between the county and the Rays.
And yeah, you got to think about it from the county's mindset, at least, because the Rays are going to be playing their games in Tampa, Steinbrenner Field next season. That's clear. The county wants them to play in Pinellas County because when you factor in people traveling to go to games, they spend their money, they get hotel rooms, they get Airbnbs, and they would like that money from that next season to go to Pinellas County on that 6% tax where the money for the stadium eventually comes. So, I even asked, Vice Chair Brian Scott, who's, said he's in favor of getting the bond deal done, in favor of this project. This was last week. He would have preferred, and that's what everyone you're going to talk to on the commission, they would have preferred them playing in Pinellas County. They kind of understand, the reasoning the Rays made it seem for why they want to play it, or why they're going to play at Steinbrenner Field. So that was the preference for everyone, no matter how it's going to impact their votes moving forward, because of that reason for being able to generate additional money that they're, wanting to pool together for this project and other ones.
Correct. And from a baseball perspective, let me just say this. In Dunedin, it was used as a Major League Baseball ballpark for the Toronto Blue Jays in 2021 post-COVID, as the Blue Jays were going to do a half season in Dunedin. They were going to do a half season in Buffalo, considering the Canada restrictions at the time. So between the two ballparks, Baycare Ballpark and TD Ballpark in Dunedin, we know that one of them has hosted baseball before. Little bit of a different scenario, considering the Blue Jays. First off, there was distance seating. So we're talking about a pandemic and fitting that in and trying to manage the amount of bodies in there, versus the Rays right now, who still want to bring the most amount of bodies as possible. The Rays averaged 16,000 fans last season. Steinbrenner Field holds north of 11,000, and that is by far the most in Florida for a minor league field. And the Yankees were already working on renovation projects to upgrade those facilities. They are pretty close to MLB standards, and you got to also factor that the Players Association is going to have a say in that as well, of the facilities for the Tampa Bay Rays players. That's why I'm sure it was also pretty important for the team to stay in the area, because the players are not going to want to stay away from home for a full year. That's just not a great situation for them. That's not fair to them. So they are staying in the area. That was very important. But objectively, it was going to take more work to get Baycare Ballpark up to speed versus Steinbrenner Field. The Rays are giving the Yankees, I believe, $15 million Like that's to be a part of this and to move their operations and to host a team and do all that stuff over there at Steinbrenner Field. I don't know what the financials would look like at Baycare Ballpark or in Dunedin. That's where balance sheets do matter. And I'm sure there was probably some hope of maybe, hey, we can fix up a little bit of Baycare Ballpark and get you the field you want, and we can kind of kill two birds with one stone. We don't know any of those logistics. We don't know if that would be possible. But I find it interesting, Aaron, that part kind of confuses me objectively. Because on one side, we have commissioners who want them to stay in Pinellas County to get all the things that you talked about. On the other side, you have them saying they're willing to kind of threaten losing the Rays completely with turning down the vote. So they're important now to kind of bring in the money, and then but not that much, right? Where there's like a tipping point in all this process. So, I think the messaging is probably more around being partners. And I think that's maybe where they were a little bit miffed, is just not being heard enough in this process.
Yeah, and I think the lack of communication, and I know the lack of communication is what miffed a lot of those commissioners. I asked the chair, Kathleen Peters, last week when they were doing a press conference unrelated to that, but related to the beaches. Have you had conversations with the Rays since the issue at Tropicana Field? She said no. She reached out trying to figure out what they were thinking, and she said, at one hand, I understand because of all the players at work when it comes to, finding this new ball field, whether that's the MLB, the Players Union, all the stuff that they have to keep in mind. And, you don't want to give certain things out and muddy those whatever negotiations have to happen. So she understands that. But, there was commissioners there, and we heard it at the meeting last week as well, where they wanted to hear more from the Rays. They wanted to hear their future plans. If they told them straight up, like, hey, we think, Tampa's going to be the best option, apologize, maybe that would have rubbed some of the commissioners better. But they wanted to have some sort of dialogue so they knew where they could be working towards or moving forward, or what they even had in mind, because at that point they didn't hear anything from the team dating back to when they last had the conversations about moving this project forward.
Yeah, and let it be known, sent a whole host of questions over to the Rays. It was a do not comment on all of them. We have heard Stu Sternberg via John Romano in his article. We've heard from Matt Silverman via T-Crass on WDAE, The Drive, and that show after kind of going to Steinbrenner. And he just sidestepped any sort of questions about the county and more so focused on moving to Tampa. But I will say from the Rays side of things, they also have been an organization that's been trying to move a lot on the fly. They are juggling a lot of balls. I will say that. Not only they had to find a home, a lot of their staff within the Rays organization, top down, also have to worry about their own homes. A lot of homes are ruined in this area. They were not, excluded from that. They're very much having to deal with a lot of personal stuff as well. The Tampa Bay Rays staff as a whole, they had to rent out, they're supposed to be housed inside the Trop. They had to rent out a building nearby in St. Pete. And for the first time in a very long time, they met together recently, as soon as a couple of weeks ago. So it's been a lot of kind of jigsaw puzzling from them. So I don't know if that necessarily is going to be a good enough explanation as to why they haven't back-channeled appropriately. But certainly they've been going through their stuff as well. So I just want to note that they do have some things as well. But obviously the communication is a bit of an issue. And here's another issue with this whole process. Let's say the bonds vote gets delayed. Why renovation? Why is relocation being thrown out there? So we know, right, $56 million as a soft estimate is what it's going to take to fix the Trop.
Yeah, $56 million is what that damage report basically laid out. How that gets paid for and the exact channels that money's coming from, that's going to be discussed at the city council level. So that's on the St. Pete side of things, not so much the county as a whole. But they're going to figure that out because there's the insurance policy with a deductible that's north of $20 million. Mayor Welch has said they're taking the necessary steps forward in that regard to get the Trop ready to go, they hope, for 2026. And And he's saying that, things like insurance and then FEMA reimbursements, possibly because the city is essentially the owner of Tropicana Field, should be able to cover most of that cost. But obviously that's another discussion that they're having just days after what could be a vote tomorrow, but I wholeheartedly expect it to be delayed once again. Obviously not what the Rays want to see based on that article and what we heard from them.
Correct. And here's the thing is, it could be more than that $56 million. And that's why you're kind of hearing the argument for more time, because there are potentially, they could get reimbursement for a lot of these things, which would change the financial picture of everything. Even before we get into the financial picture, before we worried about the hurricane stuff. But let's just hypothetically say it's delayed. The Rays have to worry about where they're playing baseball in 2026. Now, there's going to be a tight deadline here to even fix up the Trop by opening day of 2026. They can ask Major League Baseball to kind of backload their home schedule. We've seen it done before. Like most recently in hockey, the New York Islanders in their new arena, it wasn't 100% ready by opening day, or they were worried about that. So they shoved the Islanders on the road for I think it was 10 games or something, which is almost like a month in hockey. I'm slightly exaggerating. But they can go to Major League Baseball and say, hey, put us on the road back-to-back weeks to start the season. That stuff is doable. If it's we're talking weeks here, that could be managed. But at some point, if you keep delaying, the city isn't going to want to fix the Trop unless they know the bonds are going through, because why are you going to fix a building without a team that's here to stay? And that hinges on the bonds vote. And that's why with everything, it's such a ripple effect, and why Stu Sternberg and company are saying you need an answer, by the way, because we can't stop. And remember, in this financing plan, and again, you can agree or disagree and feel whatever you feel on this side of whatever we're presenting. We're just kind of laying everything out there for you to digest and then take whatever you want from that. But in that financing plan, which was easily the best deal that the Rays were going to get anywhere, they did say that they would take on the cost for overruns. So the more this is delayed, the more the financing that they agreed to at the start of this project is not the agreement that they had at the end of it. And, we're hearing kind of the spirit of things, right? The cost overruns, I think the margin for error of what you thought the cost overruns were going to be at the start of the project moving on timeline looks a little bit different from cost overruns of starting construction months from now. There's a large difference there.
Yeah, and Stu Sternberg said that in that article in the Tampa Bay Times. And the thing they're most concerned about is if this drags on further and further, they're talking about, an additional $100 million in cost potentially. At the same time, though, at least on the county level, I know they had a deadline to basically get this bond deal done in March, next March. So if that was the deadline they were working with, is the question we'd like to get answered by the Rays is, why is that deadline in March if it was so necessary to get this deal done in October and tomorrow? That's one question we're going to need to get answered.